Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Susan Howard, and I'm the director of the BATIC Institute. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. It'll be about an hour in length, and we're going to hear speakers from the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Colorado Senate, and the Virginia Department of Transportation. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A session, so please feel free to submit questions as we go so that we can get to them in the Q&A section. Before getting started, let's review a few logistics. You should have received an email with a link to the PowerPoint for this presentation, for these presentations. If you didn't, please visit the BATIC Institute website at financingtransportation.org, and a copy of the PowerPoint will be available there for download. Everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. At any time, you may submit a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel for our Q&A session. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll make it available on the BATIC Institute website within the next couple of days. So just a little bit for those of you who may be, this may be your first BATIC Institute event or you're not familiar with us, but we're an educational center that helps state DOTs and their local partners analyze, understand, and use project finance techniques to advance transportation projects within their states. And we help build capacity through a program of training, sharing of best practices on online educational tools like this webinar. The BATIC Institute is delivered as part of a partnership with the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration. And again, for more information about our resources and programs, feel free to visit the website at financingtransportation.org. So today's webinar is going to explore recent state legislative initiatives focused on increasing funding and providing additional financing for transportation. We usually do this webinar every year. We ended up taking a break, I think, in 2020 because it was such an unusual year for all of us. And particularly, I think it was sort of a kind of an outlier year in terms of revenue, given everything going on with COVID-19 and the additional federal assistance that came through. But in the past year, several states legislatures have enacted measures to bolster transportation revenue and create new sources of funding for use on transportation projects in their states. So Douglas Schenkel from the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL, is going to provide insights on recent legislation at the state level and discuss trends related to transportation funding and finance in state legislatures across the country. Colorado State Senator Faith Winter, who is chair of the Transportation and Energy Committee in the Colorado State Senate, will discuss the sustainability of transportation system legislative package signed by Governor Polis earlier this year. And Deputy Secretary Nick Donohue from Virginia DOT will talk about the road usage charge, or RUC, pilot program that was established through a larger transportation package that the Virginia legislature passed last year. So we will get started with Douglas Schenkel from NCSL and his presentation on the overview of state legislative developments.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Douglas Schenkel, and I am the Transportation Program Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL. For those of you who don't know what NCSL is, we are a national organization that serves and represents all 50 state legislatures and the legislatures of the American territories. And we serve them by answering the research requests, providing research and written deliverables on hot legislative topics, and convening meetings and webinars such as these. So our legislative constituents, which include the state lawmakers, all 7,383 of them, and the legislative staff that serve them, 30,000 plus of them, that they have access to kind of some peer-to-peer information so they can learn what's going on in other states, so they don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel if they don't need to. So very happy to be with you here today. And with that, I'm just going to go right kind of into a presentation where I talk about state transportation funding trends. I'm going to start off by kind of setting the scene a little bit. Then I'm going to talk kind of big picture about what states have been doing over the last, say 5 or 10 years with regards to transportation funding. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to dial in on kind of what the notable enacted transportation funding measures were in 2021. So without further ado, let's get going. And this first slide is just to kind of set the scene and help us think about why this is something that's so important, transportation funding. And it's on a lot of people's minds at the moment, especially in the transportation policy and industry world, because as the US transitions to more electric vehicles, but also just other vehicles that get higher mileage per gallon, that is impacting the gas tax revenue that states are taking in. And the gas tax is the main funding source for state transportation projects and systems. So we've already seen some erosion of that fuel tax revenue. And this slide, which is very nice from our friends at CDM Smith, shows basically the delta between what we could expect to collect if there was no change in the mileage per gallon of vehicles, which we know is very unlikely to be the case given states like California are mandating that a move to all electric vehicles and other states doing so in the 2030s. But this red line shows what we would expect to take in revenue as a country with these assumptions that you can see here in the slide. But then you see the kind of the delta, the difference between those. And the worrisome thing is that, we think about this as maybe being a ways off in the future, but this chart shows you that with some of the more kind of ambitious electric vehicle adoption rates, which are what these green, orange, and blue lines are, that we could start to see a national gap of over 20 billion by just 2030, which is, just 8-9 years away now. And so that's something that's, I think, weighing heavily on the minds of many states. So this next slide is from the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, ARTBA. Slide's a bit out of date, but I think it's really instructive because it tells a good story. So you look at 2000, the state highway program revenues. I think the big thing is to take a look at the blue part of the pie. In 2000, 55% of state transportation revenue came from user fees. Fast forward to 2015, and you see that's only 42%. A lot of that has to do with the decline in gas taxes and the reluctance of some states to increase gas taxes. Basically, that has been taken up by more money from the general fund and from more kind of non-transportation purposes, which you'll see in that red slice of the pie where that went from 10% to 20% in that 15-year time frame. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about what states have been doing. So states have been very active with regards to the gas tax. Since 2013, 33 states and DC have increased their gas tax. And as you can see, that kind of is geographically spread throughout the whole country. It's Democrat states, Republican states. So you're seeing it really take place everywhere. And Missouri and Colorado became the latest to join that list this year. 23 states and DC have indexed their gas taxes, meaning that their gas taxes in some way track with the economy or have some sort of floor so that they appreciate with the cost of the larger economy. Some states that's tied to population. Typically, the most typical is to be tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So as states kind of grapple with realizing that there are going to be more electric vehicles on the road and there are more and more vehicles that get very high mileage per gallon, they're starting to reckon with, well, how do we kind of make up that gap in the short term? And what a lot of states have turned to is instituting specific registration fees on electric vehicles and or plug-in hybrid vehicles. This map shows you the states with fees specifically on electric vehicles, 30 states, but there are also 14 states that have fees on plug-in hybrid vehicles. These fees range from $50 to $225 for electric vehicles, and Oklahoma and South Dakota were amongst the states to create new fees in 2021 on electric vehicles. As I mentioned, 14 states have fees on plug-in hybrids as well. This money is typically used to backfill transportation revenue accounts, but in some cases, the money is used for other purposes. Alabama, Colorado, and Washington are examples of states that use some portion of the money for EV charging infrastructure. This next slide shows you the road usage charge landscape across the country. And for those of you who do not know what a road usage charge is, it's essentially charging a driver, a motorist, based on their usage of their road. So, most commonly by the mile. And it's so, a cent, a certain amount per mile charge. There are 2 states with actual operational programs. And I'll talk more about those in a minute, but those are the states that are kind of polka dotted there, Oregon and Utah. There's a 3rd state that will have an operational program in not too long, looking at the summer of 2022, that Virginia will have an operational program. And I know that we're going to hear from the Deputy Secretary of the Virginia DOT Nick Donohue about Virginia's upcoming RUC program, so I won't go into more detail about that. But what you can see here is that there's a lot of states that are kind of studying the issue, conducting pilots. And like I said, Oregon and Utah are the two that are kind of ahead of the pack in terms of they actually have a program. They're actually collecting money. And we're seeing more and more interest from other states in analyzing, studying, and perhaps creating a RUC program. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. I want to give a quick compare and contrast of the programs in Utah and Oregon. So they both were created by the legislature, and they're both largely supported by the legislature. Utah's is only open to electric vehicles and hybrids, so I'd say that's a pretty big distinction there. They both have similar per mile charges, 1.5 cents per mile in Utah, 1.8 cents per mile in Oregon for their program called Orgo. And the drivers in both states are exempt from the electric vehicle fee that I talked about in the previous slides that exists in both these states. Drivers don't have to pay that fee if they enroll in these programs. So really, I see these programs as kind of an on-ramp to get the most obvious drivers, customers into these RUC programs, the ones that are really having most debilitating effect on the gas tax revenue collection. So this is a way to kind of try and encourage people to join these programs. These programs are completely voluntary though. And there is a variety of kind of different approaches, especially in Oregon, in terms of how you pay and who you pay to. You can use the Oregon DOT, or you can use a couple private vendors. In Utah, you just do it through one firm that they've contracted with. And so moving on to the next slide, another trend that we've seen is fees on transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft that provide ride-hailing services. And as you can see from this map, the states in blue show the states with TNC fees, and then the states with the red border around them in some way dedicate some of the money from that fee to transportation for transportation purposes, project purposes, I would say. The states that don't have the red outline, that money is mostly being used just for administrative purposes, for kind of compliance and regulation around TNC drivers and safety and regulations and what have you. But you can see there's a number of states, California, Colorado, Georgia, Maryland, New York, and Pennsylvania, that at least in part use some of this revenue for the transportation system. In Georgia, it's all dedicated to transit, largely the case in New York as well. Maryland's local communities can opt in to use these fees, so it's actually something done at the county level. And then Colorado, interestingly, is going to use some of these fees to help pay for clean vehicle fleets in the state and also for pollution mitigation. So let me go on to the next slide. And let's talk a little bit about what transpired in 2021 and the kind of most notable things that we saw take place. So first of all, in the state of Missouri, they increased a gas tax of 12.5 cents. That kind of phases in 2.5 cents a year over the next 5 years to fund maintenance for the state transportation system. That has, after a number of efforts in Missouri to raise the gas tax over the years, including a 2018 increase that was rejected by the voters. I would also note that this bill has a very interesting feature in that drivers can actually file for an annual rebate through the State Department of Revenue for that new portion of the gas tax. The existing part of the gas tax, the rebate's not available, but this is for the new one. And that was kind of a political calculus to get this through. It will be interesting to see how much that kind of impacts revenue and how much money is actually collected, how many drivers are actually applying for the rebates, but something definitely to keep an eye on. Also notably, Missouri created an electric vehicle task force to analyze the impact of electric vehicles on transportation revenue. The next really notable bill from 2021 that was enacted was from Colorado, Senate Bill 260. That raised revenue from a number of different sources, a really large package and very innovative and interesting. And we're going to have Colorado Senator Faith Winter talk about this package. So I won't really go into much depth about that, except to mention, as I said, that one of the interesting components about this is the linking of the transportation fees with pollution mitigation. So that's kind of something interesting to hear from Senator Winter. And then lastly on this slide, we have Connecticut. Connecticut created a per mile fee for trucks, and that fee will go into effect for trucks over 28,000 pounds, and those trucks would pay 2.5 cents, and then just kind of ratcheting up from there. And this is something that obviously not really particularly popular with the trucking industry, but this is something Connecticut's been in a real bad state with transportation revenue. So this is something that's definitely, the money is much needed in the state. So the Commissioner of Revenue must establish the system to collect the money, and they estimated around $90 million in annual revenues to be gleaned from this transportation funding increase. Let's next take a look at what states did in 2021 with regard to road usage charges, RUC. There were 15 states that considered RUC-related legislation in 2021. And as I mentioned before, we've seen this, steady uptick in legislative interest in RUC. That doesn't mean that there's not skepticism still and that there needs to be more policy conversations about the kind of details of what a RUC looks like. But states are definitely expanding their kind of interest and awareness of RUC. So 4 states enacted laws in 2021. The most notable definitely is California. They extended the sunset date for their pilot program until January of 2027. They also authorize a RUC pilot to identify and evaluate issues regarding revenue collection for a RUC. And they also are going to try and do a couple different pilots. One of them will be kind of more based on environmental impact and factoring in the mileage per gallon equivalent ratings published by the US EPA, EMPGs. And so it'll be really interesting to see what transpires with that. And same as kind of with other states, any kind of excess gas tax revenue or any excess gas taxes that a consumer pays, they will get those back and they won't be paying more than they would be paying in a gas tax system. And I think that's an important point to be made to kind of keep a public faith in a RUC system that it's meant to replace the gas tax, not supplement the gas tax. Also notable that Nevada passed a bill in 2021 to study a few different things regarding transportation funding revenue, and one of them is a specific study of Utah's road usage charge program. Utah, speaking of their road usage charge program, just created a special fund to deposit that money in, just to have kind of clean language that's clear that that's where the money goes, and it's to be used for administering the RUC program. In Oklahoma, interestingly, something that I wasn't necessarily on my radar, they established a task force to look at RUC, and they also authorized the state tax commission to collect charges or fees associated with a RUC program, which suggests they're maybe looking at a pilot, perhaps going to get some of the surface transportation systems funding alternative program funding that the federal government has been very helpful in providing to states. So that's kind of a picture of what states are doing with RUC in 2021. Expect to see more legislation in 2022 and perhaps more states pass bills. And then 2 other notable bills I wanted to mention, or actions I want to mention from 2021, are that 2 states actually reallocated money from existing revenue streams, sales taxes, and actually both of these cases, to give more money to from the sales tax to transportation projects. So it didn't necessarily create a new revenue source, but just reallocated from an existing state's revenue source. So raising a pretty significant amount of money, especially in Louisiana, where they're going to be getting 30% and then 60% after 2024. And lastly, I want to just talk a little bit share NCSL's transportation funding resources. So we do have a RUC toolkit page that has some fact sheets on some of the different states kind of studying or operating RUC programs. We have a webpage analyzing what states have done in the last 8 years with regards to gas taxes. We have a page on indexing gas taxes, electric and vehicle and plug-in hybrid fees. And then we have a database where we track kind of notable transportation funding legislation from across the country. And so take a look at all of those. And then my last slide is just questions. I think we're going to hold questions for the end, but here's my contact information. And really appreciate you all being here for this discussion, and really looking forward to the presentations from Senator Winter and Deputy Secretary Donohue. So with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here to talk about transportation funding in Colorado. And thank you, Doug, for that fabulous introduction. This last session, Colorado took a huge step forward with a lot of creative innovation on how we fund transportation and how we spend money on transportation. I'm going to talk about the details of how we did that and the policy that goes behind it. So first, what our transportation proposal did is it saves Coloradans money and time spent on roads. We know that Denver and Colorado have some of the worst roads in the country, some of the most gridlock, some of the highest rates of traffic, and our constituents want us to do something about it. And at the same time, this creates a transportation system that supports a dynamic economy. So we know that it's supporting deliveries, it's supporting jobs, and it's also improving air quality, because we cannot continue to talk about infrastructure and not talk about climate and air quality, which is very important in Colorado, is it establishes a sustainable funding source for our transportation system. Colorado is a very unique state in that we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which passed in 1992. And it's not a coincidence that we had not increased our gas tax since 1991. So what TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, requires is that all tax increases go to the voters. And we have spent years building coalitions with the business community, with the education community, with the environmental community, trying to create a sustainable way to fund transportation. But those were denied at the ballot. And in fact, most recently, we had a small sales tax increase to fund transportation. We also had a ballot initiative from the more conservative far-right groups that just asked the state to issue bonds without telling us how to pay for them, which meant paying for those bonds was going to be a deep cut to education funding. Both of those failed. And at the same time, our constituents kept asking us to solve transportation. So that's when we decided we had to go back to the legislature and think creatively on how we actually fund transportation and how we serve our constituents and how we address climate and air quality. And I'll go through the details of how we did that. So ultimately, the package we came up with it's a little bit higher than this. It ended up being about $5.3 billion. And that's just on the next 10-year time horizon. But it was really important that for us, that this funding went on in perpetuity. So the numbers I'm going to present are on 10 years, but they don't sunset after 10 years. So the revenue is going to continue and increase. And one of the things we really wanted to make sure we were doing was future-proofing our transportation system, both future-proofing how we pay for it and what we spend money on, and make it sustainable in the long term, which we'll talk about. So we did include a federal and state stimulus that we've received, and we included some additional general fund commitment, and then we included some additional fees. And so ultimately, about $5.3 billion is going to be invested in our transportation system over the next 10 years. So we'll talk about the general fund and stimulus commitments. In a moment, I want to talk about the fees that we're adding on in a variety of areas. And a lot of folks have said, it's amazing in Colorado that you got places like Uber and Lyft and Grubhub and DoorDash and the car share companies and rental car companies and the truckers to agree to this package. How did you do it? And it's because we didn't single any one entity out as carrying the entire burden of funding the transportation system. Instead, we went to everyone and said, we need to come together. We can all invest a little bit more. And when we all come together and invest a little bit more, we can have a sustainable system. And that meant the legislature investing some more with some general fund commitment. And so you see that we have some general fund commitment into different places. So the State Highway Fund, multimodal, Main Streets Project, which are really exciting projects that make our communities more walkable and livable. And then one-time general fund or stimulus dollars, which we committed to this package as well. And that was really important to show that the legislature wasn't just asking folks to pay more, we were also paying more. So where does this money come from? And I'll go through these inputs of how we're paying for that $5.3 billion. And this really goes back to what I said, that we're future-proofing how we use our roads. And so during the pandemic, I would sit in my office and be on Zoom calls for 8 to 10 hours a day. My children were homeschooling, and I would have DoorDash deliver their lunch. I would have Amazon deliver their school supplies. I would have Winnie Bee deliver my wardrobe. I would have Instacart deliver my groceries, and I would never get in my car. I never got in my car. I never filled up my gas tank. I never paid for those roads through the gas tax. However, I relied every single day on those services to come to me and use those roads. And so how people are relating to the roads is changing. We know that a lot of younger folks aren't owning cars anymore. They're relying on Uber and Lyft and public transit. So how do we make sure how we're paying for the roads reflects how people are using the roads? And that's how we future-proof funding. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute. So the road usage fee. I talked about Tabor and Colorado a little bit. So we cannot have the legislature increase taxes. However, Tabor gives us the ability to impose fees. But there's a lot of rules that come with imposing fees. The people that pay those fees have to directly benefit from those fees. And the government has to be acting like a business to collect those fees and use those fees. So we added a road usage fee, which is not mileage-based. It is just an additional fee at the gas pump. It starts at 2 cents and builds up to 8 cents over time. And so it somewhat looks like a gas tax. But when you collect a tax, you can use it on anything you want. You can use it on roads or prisons or healthcare or schools. But when you collect a fee, there's very strict restrictions. So we have had a road usage fee, which is collected at the gas pump. We have a bridge and enterprise fee, which is collected when you register your vehicle. And then we have our EV equalization fee. And so when we talk about how we're spending money, Colorado is working really hard to have a very quick and rapid adoption of electric vehicles. And those cars also need to be responsible for paying for the roads they're driving on. And so currently our electric vehicle fee is $50. And so we have this increasing over the next 6 years to $159. So that's what electric vehicles are paying in. And then TNC fee, so transportation networks, Uber and Lyft, essentially. It's a 30-cent per ride fee because you are relying on the roads. Uber and Lyft are relying on good roads and hopefully less traffic to have a good business model. So we have a TNC fee. Then we have a delivery fee. So this is Amazon, Uber, Lyft, Grubhub, Instacart. So when I'm sitting here doing homeschooling during the pandemic, trying to keep up with my Zoom calls and everything's coming to my front porch, I'm also paying into the roads that rely on that. And then we have a personal car share, which is essentially Airbnb for your own car. That's becoming wildly popular and growing very quickly, but they didn't have the same fees that rental cars have. And so you would come into Denver if you're a tourist, or if you don't own a car and you just need a car for a day, and you could do a personal car share, but actually not pay the same way that rental cars do. So we added in a personal car share fee. And then on the rental cars, we index their fee so that it continues to increase and they continue to pay into the system. We also have taxis. They're less and less part of the market, but we're going to do a study on how they pay into the system. And we are going to also do a study on autonomous vehicles, because ultimately we know autonomous vehicles are coming. But the worst thing that could happen in the future is that you're stuck in traffic on I-25, our major highway here in Denver, and you look in front of you and there's an empty vehicle, and to the side of you is an empty vehicle, and behind you is an empty vehicle. So how do we actually price before these come on the markets to make empty autonomous vehicles very expensive and full autonomous vehicles really cheap? And so we're starting that process through this bill. And then we also worked on allocating and future-proofing how we're spending money, because just like how people are using the roads and paying for the roads is changing, expectations of our transportation infrastructure and what we need out of our transportation infrastructure are changing. So HUTF stands for the Highway Users Trust Fund. This is the long-standing way that in Colorado we have funded transportation. And we have always allocated 60% of that to the state HUTF, which is CDOT, the Colorado Department of Transportation, and then local HUTF, which goes to local cities and counties to distribute on projects that they think is regionally important. So something that's very important to note in Colorado is, even though I'm chair of transportation, I don't allocate money to specific projects. We have a very ground up approach through our MPOs and our local governments that identify projects that need funding. It's studied by CDOT and our Transportation Commission, which makes recommendations. And so I, as a transportation chair, can't just say, hey, my intersection near my house seems problematic, I want a couple $1 million for it. And we've had this tradition for over 100 years in Colorado, and it's worked very well for us in terms of building coalitions with our local governments, with CDOT, and with the state government, and really keeps the legislature out from abusing power. So maintaining this HUTF allocation was really important. And at the same time, we knew that there was places, especially in the Front Range in the Denver metro area, that we have a lot more people paying a lot more money into the transportation infrastructure, and maybe allocation wasn't quite equitable. And at the same time, these places are faced with more pollution. They have a lot more disproportionately impacted communities that are impacted by environmental racism and pollution from transportation projects. So we created a new fund, which is a non-attainment fund. So these are funds for areas that are in non-air attainment, according to EPA standards. And these areas, which are more populated, have more disproportionately impacted communities, can apply for this money to specifically improve air quality. And that was really important. We had a bridge enterprise. And so in the last couple of years, Colorado's done a good job in bringing out the safety of our bridges, but we have a lot of tunnels that are in disrepair and not safe. So we added in the tunnel maintenance to our bridge enterprise fund. And then we have our revitalizing main streets, which we increase the investment into that. And those are where there's a CDOT, a Colorado Department of Transportation major highway going through a city. And how can we, one of the things that this was used for is, in a small town in rural Colorado, most of the students lived on the opposite side of a CDOT road from where the school was. So the students are living on one side, the school's on the other. It's not super safe to cross a major highway twice a day. So they built an overpass. Some cities have used these to help keep restaurants open and providing those outdoor eating areas during the pandemic. And so revitalizing main streets is really self-descriptive. How do we create and keep and maintain and expand those main streets that are walkable and livable and support our local businesses and our local schools. And then we have our multimodal option fund. Colorado has more rural public transit than any other state in the country, which is something we should be proud of. And we have a historic investment in the multimodal option fund across the state to make sure we're expanding public transit choice, we're reducing vehicle miles traveled, we're cleaning the air. And then Front Range Rail. I know that we are all anxiously awaiting what Congress is actually going to do on infrastructure, but we've been working very closely with Amtrak. And one of Amtrak's top priorities is to get rail from Pueblo to Cheyenne in Colorado. This would be a game changer for Colorado. So we put $2.5 million to make sure that we're getting those environmental studies up and going to make us attractive for those federal dollars. So we're really looking at how we're spending our transportation dollars on safety, on community, on land use, on climate, and on air quality, which is really exciting. And then we know that we have to electrify as fast and as much as we can to address climate. So Colorado has some pretty aggressive climate goals in terms of carbon reduction. And right now, transportation is the #1 carbon emitter in the state. And so we have to electrify. So we created 3 enterprises, which goes back to Tabor. Enterprises are fees, and they have to be spent specifically on the people that pay in and how they benefit. So the community access enterprise is making sure that consumers have the trust to buy an electric vehicle and the ability. So how are we making sure that there's adequate charging stations? If you live in an apartment complex, how are we making sure that multifamily housing has adequate charging stations? Colorado is an outdoor state. I go camping and hiking every single weekend. If I buy an EV, how do I know there's going to be an electric vehicle charging station near my campsite, near my trail location? And so that's the new community access. The Clean Fleet is really working with the truckers, and the truckers supported this bill and came in a big way, and they're already working with CDOT on transitioning their fleets to electric vehicles. And so this is some additional funding to make that transition happen quicker. And then new clean transit enterprises. That's more electric buses for multimodal option fund and public transit departments. It's also things like municipal fleets, county fleets, and electric school buses, and making sure that we are thinking as much as we can, how do we get more electric vehicles on the road? And then we have that non-attainment enterprise, which I talked about in our bridge enterprise. So this is the total enterprise amount of money in this package. And so we are investing $310 million in charging infrastructure and electric vehicle equity. We're looking at how do we make electric vehicles affordable to low-income folks, because this shouldn't just be something that high-income folks get to take advantage of. Fleet electrification incentives, and then that public transit electrification, and really looking at how do we electrify as quick as possible, because our first climate goals that we have to meet are in 2025, and we cannot afford to miss those goals. And we're not going to meet those goals without some pretty aggressive electrification. We also made sure to align this with the federal infrastructure plan so that we still qualify for all the federal money that could come in, especially around Front Range Rail, and we're working very diligently to attract that money to Colorado. We did have that general fund commitment saying that the legislature is not just asking all these other entities to pay in, but we are as well. We have an ongoing review of the electric vehicle fees to make sure it's fair and equitable, and we don't inadvertently having EVs pay more than standard vehicles. We also empowered local communities to create their own funding sources for their own transportation projects, which was really important to our local partners, which I'll talk about our coalition and our process to get here in a minute. And as I've said before, this future-proofs our transportation system. So this, of course, cannot be done. You don't get to spend $5.3 billion without having some accountability and transparency. And so each enterprise will develop a 10-year plan that's going to report out to the public and the General Assembly and the administration their accomplishments and if they're meeting their goals. CDOT and the enterprises are going to have accountability mechanisms and engage in a wide array of stakeholder processes. In fact, CDOT is currently running a very transparent process on doing a rule around greenhouse gas mitigation and greenhouse gas reductions, which brings us to our climate goals. So we have to meet our climate goals, and it's part of our greenhouse gas roadmap that the administration has put together, and the legislature is working very hard to make sure that we achieve. And then our enterprises will maintain accessible and transparent summary of information through a variety of dashboards. So this is seen as one of the most creative bills in the country because we brought in a whole variety of stakeholders and fees and ended up getting them on board where we didn't have Uber and Lyft and Grubhub opposing us. We didn't have taxis opposing us. We didn't have the rental car companies opposing us. So how did we do that? So first, we've been setting up this process for several years. It started in 2019. We passed then Senate Bill 19239, which was a study and a stakeholder process through CDOT to study which fees and use of roads we could talk about. So this was not a new conversation to those folks that we were asking for fees on. They have been participating in 2.5 years of stakeholder meetings, and it's how we chose the level of fees. Why we got to 27 cents, and in transparency, the delivery people wanted 22 cents, but we negotiated and got to 27. So all of that was started 3 years before we introduced this. And then as we started working towards this, my House sponsor and transportation chair, Representative Gray, and I had 137 stakeholder meetings. We started talking to everyone that cared about transportation, which everyone does, because everyone touches transportation every single day. And so we met with the construction industry, we met with the gig economy, we met with chambers of commerce, we met with environmental stakeholders, we met with public transit agencies, we met with local governments, mayors, city councilors. And first we started asking, what are your aspirations? What do you want to get out of this? And what are your bottom lines? And we listened and we took notes and we responded. And ultimately we built a coalition that was too big to fail. And we added in some great sponsors and leadership. We had the majority leader from the Senate, the speaker from the House, the governor was fully on board. We didn't have a lot of bipartisan support in the building, mostly because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We had one Republican, Senator Priola, that stood with us. And we had a lot of outside Republican support. For example, Mayor John Southers from Colorado Springs, who's former Attorney General. So we had a lot of Republican local officials that knew that investing in infrastructure was so vitally important, and this was the way we could get it done. So we had 137 stakeholder meetings. We negotiated. No one got everything they wanted. No one got nothing they wanted. And ultimately, we were able to keep everyone at the table because we said we're all in this together. We're treating everyone fairly and equitably. And we're going to be very transparent in how we're spending money and how that is going to help both our constituents, our state, our air quality, and your business models. So this is just overall at a good glance what we did. Like I said, this number's a little low. We got to 5.3 billion. We invested general fund and a summary of where we're spending it. And with that, I'm very excited to take any questions people have.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Nick Donohue, and I have the pleasure of serving as Deputy Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth of Virginia. I've been asked this afternoon to come speak with the group to talk about Virginia's highway use fee and our mileage-based user fee program. I'm going to focus mostly on how Virginia ended up considering a proposal of this nature and why we thought it was important to move forward and implement something along these lines. And so I want to start with this discussion. Really, this kind of goes back to 2018. At that time, we were taking a look at our various revenue streams. We had just received an update from the Department of Tax, and we were looking at a number of things. And a kind of a startling trend stuck out to us as we looked at FY16 and then also FY17 and FY18. And what we saw over the course of those years is that our vehicle miles traveled in the Commonwealth and also nationally were increasing, but our fuels tax collections were decreasing. And so, and we first saw it in FY16 and thought it was just kind of a hiccup or an anomaly. In FY17, they were kind of similar, but we were still lower than where we expected. And then FY18, we were about $40 million less than our forecast, while driving had gone up several percentage points. And then we saw it happen again in FY19. We reported on that to our General Assembly, and that led us to work with them on a sustainability of Virginia's transportation revenues. And so our Appropriations Committee in the House and Finance Committee in the Senate directed us to take a look at the sustainability of our transportation revenues with a specific focus on the impact of fuel-efficient and electric vehicles on the sustainability of our motor fuels tax. And so we hired KPMG and put together a work group, and we examined this issue for about 9 months. We developed a number of kind of detailed models looking at fleet mix in Virginia, the projected increase in driving, and a host of the fleet turnover over time, as well as kind of the penetration and adoption of electric vehicles, looking at a number of forecasts from Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, Bloomberg, and other types of folks to understand what the impacts might be on Virginia's transportation revenues, again, with that focus on the motor vehicle sales and use tax over time. The key finding was both unsurprising and surprising at the same time. So what we found at the kind of conclusion of that work was that due to the changes in the vehicle fleet, our fuel tax was going to be about 35% less in 2030 than it otherwise should have been based on changes in driving. So that wasn't surprising because we were already starting to see that happen. We'd already seen a 5% split kind of between increases in driving and our fuels tax collections just over a 4-year period there starting in fiscal year 2016. What was surprising, and I think kind of really opened our eyes and sent us down this path in Virginia, is a lot of the discussion focus up until that time had been on electric vehicles. And our analysis showed that, yes, electric vehicles were going to reduce our fuels tax collections in 2030, but of the 35% or so reduction, they were like 3.5%. The biggest impact was fuel usage due to increased fuel economy. So these are normal types of vehicles that we all kind of drive, but instead of getting 20 miles to the gallon, you're now getting 30 miles to the gallon. Or folks switching from, a 30 mile per gallon car to a hybrid, or something else of that nature. And that was really driving the remaining reductions that we were expecting to see in our fuels tax collections over that period of time. Now, Virginia had previously tried to address impacts of EV and hybrid vehicles during the 2013 transportation funding bill that we passed. And in that bill, they put in place a $64 surcharge that was paid by all electric vehicles and all hybrids. That became effective on July 1, 2013, and that was repealed effective July 1, 2014. It turned out to be an extremely controversial policy in Virginia, namely because for two main reasons. Folks were able to say that it was unfair that all hybrid vehicles paid the same fee because, they have different fuel economies. And they also thought that we were penalizing people who had made environmentally friendly choices. So knowing that we had tried to address this in the past, but also that our work had been overturned by the General Assembly in just one short year after they had put it in place, we started to think of what is a way in which we can try to fairly collect these revenues from these more fuel-efficient vehicles. And so that led us to the development of the concept of a highway use fee. And what this fee is you pay this fee if your car has a greater fuel economy than the average fuel economy in Virginia in 2020. And that was 23.7 miles per gallon. And so if your car gets 30 miles per gallon, you pay your gas tax clearly for the amount of miles that you drive. And then you pay this highway use fee, which is sized based on the difference in gas tax that you paid compared to the average fuel economy, in 2020. And so again, say that's $5 is the difference, and I'm just kind of using numbers here, you would pay 85% of that difference. If your car got 40 miles to the gallon, that might be $30 difference between what you paid and the car with the average fuel economy paid, and you pay a highway use fee that was 85% of that difference there. And what this highway use fee does for the Commonwealth is we think it really addresses the long-term sustainability of our motor fuels tax, along with the indexing that we put in place at the same time, because whether more cars and the market increases the fuel efficiency at a rate higher than what we expected, then the highway use fee will help us collect those dollars. At the same time, if for whatever reason the trend towards crossover SUVs or SUVs on car frames, which really are these 4-cylinder cars that are driving a lot of the kind of increase in fuel efficiency in Virginia, if that happens slower than we expect, then our fuels tax index to inflation will capture the revenues that we need. So either way, we kind of have a hedge put in place. And that allows us to move forward with confidence that we do have a much more sustainable revenue stream moving forward in the future. Now, a fair question to say is, did people view this as fair? Did people see this as unfair? And so the way we really try to think about this is looking at similar types of cars with different model years and just looking at the difference in the fuels tax that they pay in Virginia. So I'm going to go through a few kind of examples here quickly because this was really compelling as we worked with our legislature to talk about what we saw as a really inequitable situation that we had before the highway use fee with the fuels tax in Virginia. And so let's talk about Toyota Camry. If you have a 2000 Toyota Camry, that gets about 23 miles to the gallon. You would have paid in Virginia $81.70 in fuels tax. If you had a 2009 Toyota Camry, that gets 25 miles to the gallon, and you would have paid $75, or about $6 less. If you had a 2019 Toyota Camry, you get 34 miles to the gallon, and you pay $55, or 32% less than what a 2000 Toyota Camry pays. If you happen to have a 2019 hybrid, you only pay $36 in gas tax in Virginia. And again, compare that to a 2000 Toyota Camry that would have paid $80. So you're paying less than half in gas tax of what the 2000 Toyota Camry pays. And, we went out and did field inspections of all these Toyota Camrys. Interestingly, they all had 4 wheels. They all had 4 doors. And they all had 5 seats. And my real kind of point here is these vehicles are all the same size. They take up the same amount of space on the road. They all weigh basically the same. In fact, the hybrid weighs about 500 pounds more than the non-hybrid vehicles. Yet the driver of that hybrid vehicle is paying more than 50% less than the person driving the 2000 Toyota Camry And we really didn't think that that was fair. And so a lot of the discussion we had with the assembly was just saying, why should somebody who just happens to have purchased a brand new car pay dramatically less in fuel tax, whether it's a hybrid or not? Because again, if you look at the 2019 Toyota Camry, they're still paying 32% less than a 2000 Camry. And again, we hope to collect in that year in Virginia around $900 million in fuel tax. And so if everybody paid 32% less in fuel tax, that's $300 a year. Over our 6-year programming horizon, that's $1.8 billion. That is a dramatic impact on our transportation budget. The stats I gave you for the Camry, we can repeat across the board here, looking at all sorts of different types of vehicles. So a Ford F-150, if you have a 2000 Ford F-150, you pay $120 in gas tax. If you have a 2019, you'd only pay $94, 22% less. If you have a 2000 Hyundai Sonata, you would have paid $90 in gas tax. If you had a 2019, you would have paid $66, 26% less. If you had a 2019 hybrid, you would have paid about half of what somebody with a 2000 Hyundai Sonata would have had. And so that really was the kind of way in which we talked about the concept of this highway use fee with our legislature, and it connected with them. They really understood that that was not fair, that these vehicles that weighed the same, were the same size, and could carry the same number of passengers, you had people paying dramatically different amounts in gas tax just simply because of the changes in fuel economy that happened over the time, in addition to the kind of, substantial impacts that KPMG projected of, again, our fuels tax collections going down 34% over a 10-year period, which really dramatic decrease there. The other kind of thing we had to address working with our legislatures, this highway use fee is all based on whether or not you drive kind of the average amount that someone in Virginia drives, which today is around 11,600 miles. And so there are a number of people who live in some of our denser urban areas that really don't drive as much. And so we needed to make sure that we were able to address the concerns that we had heard from the old hybrid fee about it's not fair that I'm paying this because I have different fuel economy. That was addressed by the highway use fee. The thing that wasn't addressed is what happens if I live in an area with a lot of transit access and I don't drive very much. I don't drive 11,000 miles a year. I drive 2,000 miles a year. That was another one of the complaints we heard about the hybrid fee. And so we established the mileage-based user fee to ensure that those folks who were subject to the highway use fee, if they happened to live in an area where they didn't drive very much, that they wouldn't be subjected to the full highway use fee. They would have the option of opting into the voluntary mileage-based user fee, where they would pay on a per mile basis, the equivalent of their highway use fee, but on a pro rata share. So if they only drove 2,000 miles, they paid 2,000 divided by 11,600, their share of the highway use fee over the course of that year. And it took away a lot of the complaints and concerns that we had heard previously when we had tried to do this moving forward. Today, we are collecting the highway use fee in Virginia. So this was adopted by the Assembly during our 2020 General Assembly session. We started collecting it on July 1. Our mileage-based user fee program is going to start on July 1, 2022. We are currently working our Department of Motor Vehicles with a number of vendors to hire someone to stand up that program and get it running. We do expect to have a number of participants here in the first year. We may look at kind of limiting participation initially just to make sure that everything goes smoothly, but we do see this becoming a kind of an open program for anyone who has to pay that highway use fee in Virginia. And so that's really how and why we got to that place in Virginia. It really started again with us looking at the sustainability of our transportation revenues, trying to understand what the core problem was. And again, the problem wasn't just EVs, which is a lot of the discussion that you hear today when you talk to people about declining fuels tax revenues. And so, it was those fuel efficient vehicles that are really the risk factor in the midterm. And so what could we do to address that while also capturing EVs over the long term? And how can we do that in a fair and equitable manner? To be direct, this is a decent amount more complicated than our old hybrid fee. The flip side, I would say, is we've had 2 legislative sessions since this was adopted, and there has not been a single piece of legislation put forward to repeal it. And when you compare that to our old hybrid fee, which was very simple and very easy to explain, there were about 12 pieces of legislation introduced in the next session to repeal it. And as I mentioned earlier, they were successful, and that was repealed, 1 short year after it was implemented. So we really wanted to develop something to address these key issues related to our fuels tax sustainability, but do it in a manner that we thought addressed a lot of those concerns we had previously heard. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here this afternoon, and I look forward to the discussion and answering any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much to all our panelists. I'm going to see if they're available to come on camera. We'll do a little bit of Q&A. Thanks, Nick. I am curious so both Faith and Nick, you spoke about how there was, a certain amount of groundwork that had to be laid over multiple years. Tell us a little bit more about that. What did you feel like was the most necessary, or the most necessary steps to get you to a place where you could move this package through? Because I think we have heard that consistently from states that sometimes the first try isn't successful. You're really trying to lay the groundwork with all the various stakeholders over time. So what do you kind of attribute this success to this time?
So Susan, I'll jump in because I'm not sure if Faith's here or not. So I think the key thing to our success was twofold. The first was demonstrating to our legislature why the need existed. And the key thing that really helped bring our legislature kind of to that conclusion was, our vehicle miles traveled going up year after year, and our fuel tax collections going down year over year. And so again, it happened once, then it happened again, then we told them about it, and it happened again that very same fiscal year. And that led the legislature to actually direct us to study the sustainability of our fuels tax, along with our other revenue sources, which was part of that report I mentioned in my remarks that found that it was really, in the near term and midterm, the fuel efficient vehicles, more so than the electric vehicles, that were going to create the issues for our fuels tax. And so getting the legislature really bought in an understanding as to why there was a problem and the need to try and study and do something about it was, I think, the kind of the first key component. And then the second thing, as I mentioned in the remarks, was coming up with something that people viewed as fair, even if it was a bit complicated. So candidly, like our highway use fee, it is not a one-liner. It's not, hey, we got this hybrid fee because hybrids don't pay much in gas tax. Like, we tried that and we got our clocks cleaned. Like, it did not go over well. It was repealed as quickly as it could be. And again, we have this other fee here that we can demonstrate again the need for with the data that we've done and the report the assembly asked for. And then importantly, we are able to address those concerns that it's a fair fee. We are just trying to make sure people pay generally similar amounts when they use the roadway system in the same amount. And so again, those comparisons between different types of cars, that was when we're in committee and people are saying, this isn't fair. Why should my hybrid pay a higher amount? Or why should my newer car, which is more fuel efficient, pay this fee? That's a benefit of having the more fuel efficient car. We would just talk about, well, what about someone with the exact same car that's just 20 years older? Like, how's that fair? And the answer is it's not. Like, nobody can really defend kind of that position. And then the other kind of point that I think often gets lost, because the biggest pushback we had to our fee was from folks saying we were penalizing environmentally friendly choices and kind of taking away turnover in the fleet that we want to see to more fuel efficient cars. Is we also talked about like the fuel savings these people see compared to the amount of this fee. So this fee is like $10-15 for most cars. And I would question whether or not that actually influences someone's purchasing decision when they're at a dealership. You're spending $20,000 a car. I'm not sure a $15 fee influences you, but if for some reason it does, I think the point we also made is these people are also saving $200 a year in fuel. Or if you're driving an EV, you could be saving, $1,000 a year in fuel. And again, so this $15 fee, $100 fee, whatever it might be, really is kind of minuscule relative to the much broader savings, which is not buying nearly as much gas.
And Faith is here, but I had to switch my phone, so I can't be on camera, unfortunately. But good to see you all. And I think echoing what Nick said is we had a more complicated policy, but a policy everyone thought was fair, right? And so we did not single out any one type of user, any one type of fee. We didn't single out one type of goal. So we didn't just prioritize new construction. We didn't just prioritize repair. We didn't just prioritize public transit or climate or rural, right? And so everyone got something to keep them at the table. And we built upon years and years of coalition building to get a transportation funding package through. So that coalition had been started several years ago to work on ballot initiatives. And so working with those coalitions, keeping everyone at the table was really important. My co-sponsor and I had a meme that we texted back and forth that said, yes, we know you don't love everything in this bill, right? But that kind of summarizes where we were, where not, you know, there was some people that didn't like the climate stuff, and then environmentalists wanted no new streets at all. And so we kept everyone by giving everyone something and by making sure it was fair, and by listening, right? It's doing the basic organizing work.
Thank you, Senator Winter. That's very helpful. Doug, I'd like to have you come on, and I wanted to ask your presentation was great and extremely comprehensive. I'm curious what you hear the most about from legislators across the country. I mean, I think that every state is different. We know this, and they're in different places in terms of what they're considering. For years and years, I think EVs was kind of front and center as sort of wanting to be able to capture that revenue from drivers who aren't paying into the fuel tax. But I'm curious what you see, where you see interest bubbling up, and what we might look for or look to in the future.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Susan. I would say the main, I guess, tenor of the questions that we get as it relates to transportation funding and financing is, just to kind of put it broadly, looking for something new, kind of recognizing everything that we've talked about today, that the gas tax is, you know, just continually kind of being depreciating. And so we get a lot of questions wondering what other states are doing to tap into new sources. Something like what Senator Winter and the Colorado legislature did is a good example, looking at doing some kind of more creative things with the delivery fees and the TNC fees. Not to say that some other states have done that, but taking a look at that, obviously more of the short-term consideration is maybe just raising the gas tax or putting in some general fund dollars. Then, as I alluded to in the presentation, the road usage charge conversation is certainly, you know, it's still in its infancy, I guess, but it's maybe moving into toddlerhood. So there's more states considering it. There's more lawmakers that are interested in it and conversant in it now. That doesn't mean that it's going to come to fruition in some of these states anytime soon, just because there's a lot of as Deputy Secretary Donohue said, it's not simple to explain. And I think the initial reaction from the public is like, what? Like, why do I have to pay? Like, I've talked to people that you're like, you know, thought like, oh, you have electric vehicles, that means you're never going to have to pay. They just didn't really think about the roads part of it. They thought like, oh, the electricity payment will take care of that. So communicating with the public, but yeah, just looking for new fees. There's interest in public-private partnerships and the financing side, which we didn't talk about as much today. But yeah, I would say that's the main things I can think of.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely think that you know, some of the innovative things with TNCs and car sharing and obviously delivery fees, like really, Senator Winter did a great job in her presentation of pointing out how our perception of all of that really did change during the pandemic and how much we rely on that, you know, timely delivery of goods and services. And that is a kind of a new paradigm, I think, for us as we look at revenue options in the future. So for Deputy Secretary Donohue, we did get a question about, a couple questions specifically about your RUC program. I'm hoping you can address. One is about diesel that might have been excluded from the pilot. If there's any justification for the types of alternative fuels that you were looking at there. And second, the issue of individual privacy, which I think has been a perennial one when we deal with RUC programs. But you know, people may not want to report the number of miles they drive. They feel like that's an invasion of their privacy. How have you tried to address those privacy concerns with the new system that you're going to be launching in the next year? Are you there? Okay.
I'm not sure if Nick's still there, but this is Faith. And
Yeah,
I'll just add, one of the major reasons we didn't do a road usage fee was because of those privacy concerns. But we are doing a study to do more road usage fees, especially within the private sector, because when we look at places like the truckers or school buses or Uber and Lyft or Grubhub and Uber Eats, they're tracking all of that information already. And you're already giving over a lot of that information when you're using the app. In those coalition partners weren't quite ready for a user fee yet, or by mile fee. And so we're looking at studying that, but it was a big political hurdle. And one of the reasons that that was not in the Colorado bill was, how does this work? We had a successful pilot project, but we had a lot of pushback from the average citizen about government in their car dictating how much they drive and how much they don't drive.
Oh, I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that we might have had some technical issues with Virginia DOT. So, and we're at the end of our time anyway. We didn't get to all the questions, but we can hopefully try to put them to you in the future and have you answer some of them. But I'm very grateful for your time, Doug Schenkel, Secretary Faith Winter, Deputy Secretary Donohue, for joining us. Please stay in touch with us. As I said, a recording of this webinar will be available on the BATIC Institute webinar. Thanks to everybody for attending, and please stay in touch with us and continue to participate in future events. Thanks so much to our panelists and all of you for joining us today.